And I've worked with a lot of startups in the DMZ, and to be honest, I tend to disappoint them when I first meet them because they come to me and they expect me to say, well, your operations look like this, so we need to install Intercom and we need to get Zendesk and we need to get Salesforce. Uh, and the problem is that every single startup is different and you're all resource constrained. And the needs and requirements of your operations all completely vary. So if I were to come in and tell you to do that, I'm probably just going to waste a lot of your time and a lot of your money. What I mean by that is I've seen very successful companies operating with things like a Google Doc, GPS, and a lot of people scrabbling around calculating things. I've also seen very successful companies operating with vast bespoke back-end databases, software, their own admin systems, etc. I've seen successful companies work with back-end operations that involve outsourced teams in low-cost countries, or they're hybrids. And what I want to emphasize first is that your operations or the operations of your company are really dependent upon what you're doing. And so when I start to talk about operations, the first thing we have to do is to understand what we're trying to do within operations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about operations management, but we need to bear in mind that we need to find a way to understand your company and what actually makes it grow, what inflects your growth, and what needs to be worked on, but also what doesn't need to be worked on. And that's the core thing. I'm not just going to tell you to install Salesforce and Zendesk and Intercom, because you've got really limited resources. And what we need to understand is what is the main driver of your startup, and how do we ensure that that is optimized, and how do we sort of ignore or push off to the side the things that don't matter. And that means that we actually need to start by taking a step back, and we need to start thinking about the high-level strategy and drivers of your startup, because there are certain things that make startups really big, and there are certain things that will make a very nice sized startup, but we can really identify those. And so we actually start looking at strategy. We need to start thinking about what are the things that make startups really, really big. What builds an Amazon or a Facebook or an Uber? And there are very, very definite particular qualities that we can draw out of startups that build big companies. And once we understand that, then we can start to dive into what drives those effects. And we can start to look at what metrics and numbers we need to be measuring and understanding. And then from that, we can start to understand what inflects those numbers, so those tactics. Once we understand those tactics, we can start to dig into how the company actually operates as a series of blocks. We can start to use an analogy of the startup as a production line. And using that, we can start to understand what are the bottlenecks, what do you need to improve, where do you need to put in software or processes or tools, and where do you not need to. And so that's how we're going to start. It's going to be high-level strategy first, into what drives your growth, into your numbers, and then how we can understand your company holistically. Just as a little bit more background, as Blake said, I'm a serial entrepreneur. I specialize in operations. I know enough code to be dangerous. I have a master's in engineering from Cambridge, and I specialized sorry, I'm blanking what I specialized in. I specialized in AI before it was actually a thing. I specialized in signal processing and particularly the application of machine learning algorithms to signals. I have an MBA from Harvard Business School. I've started a couple of companies myself. I've had no big exit yet, but we're working on that one. As Blake said, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is based upon my experience at Chef Hero, where I was VP of Operations. So sorry, this is my daughter as well. If you hear little noises in the background, it's because I have a wonderful 18-month-old daughter. She's super cute. Within my company, this is what we call pair programming. My daughter is almost fluent in Python. She's got great CSS skills, loves putting buttons everywhere. So this is her helping me write a little bit of code for my website a few months ago. So what are we trying to do here in terms of operations? I'm going to guide us into the area of operations management. And that is all about how we design, how we understand, and how we optimize an entire production system. that takes inputs, things like money, employees, resources, funding, tools, and turns those into your end products or services or goods or whatever you deliver. And what we're trying to do is to understand how that works holistically and to optimize it. Because the last thing you want to do as a startup is receive a load of money and waste it because your processes are bad, or get a number of salespeople and hire them and then find out that you have a bottleneck because you can't bring in enough marketing qualified leads, or find that you've brought on a load of active customers, but they're the wrong type of customer. So we want a way to look at your company holistically to make sure it is operating correctly. So what we're going to do with this, as I said, is to look at the overall objectives of the business. That's the strategy side. We're then going to build a framework around how your company can operate. And we're going to start analyzing that via the lens of the startup as a production line. I'll talk a lot more about this, but basically we can start looking at it as if it were a car production plant or a production system, sort of stamping out pieces of metal, cutting them, welding them, and we can start to analyze where there's bottlenecks, where there's issues or where there's problems and what we need to work on. And that will then lead us into how we can improve your company. And then we're going to introduce why customer acquisition cost, CAC, and customer lifetime value, LTV, are great metrics to understand your company holistically, because they give that balance and they give that view of how the company is doing overall. So I'm going to use an example. Back at Chef Hero, we had at the start an outbound sales team, and they would go out to restaurants and they would introduce our product, which was an app-based marketplace where a restaurant could go on and say, I need to order cheese and tomatoes and lettuce and cucumbers, and there are a host of different vendors that could sell that to me. I want to find out which one's the best quality, or which one is the cheapest, or which one can deliver tomorrow. And so we had salespeople who go out and sell this product to restaurants. And initially we said, well, we want lots and lots of restaurants using this. So we had a metric where salespeople recorded how many restaurants they sold, and we posted that on our dashboard. And what we found was our salespeople going out and selling lots and lots of restaurants. They're getting lots of them to become active on our app. And it was great, except that the restaurants were ordering like a case of lettuce, or a couple of tomatoes, or a couple of cucumbers. And so we had lots of restaurants, but they were placing like $50 or $75 orders every single week. And we said, well, this is silly. You know, most restaurants are spending about $10,000 a month on produce, etc. Why are these restaurants spending nothing? And we found that the salespeople had gone out and they'd sold little pizza places, little pita places that basically weren't using much in terms of produce, but they just wanted something that was quick and easy so they could order it. We said, well, this is no good. Like, we want to be generating large volumes of transactions in our marketplace. So then we told the salespeople, we're not going to measure how many restaurants you bring on board. We're going to measure the dollar value of their spend. And we thought, you know, they'll go out and they'll find good-sized restaurants. And suddenly, the number of restaurants we had onboarding was like that. And weeks went by, and then suddenly a really big restaurant would come in. And a salesperson would close a really big high-end restaurant, and they place an enormous order. But we scratched our heads and said, well, what's happening here? Suddenly we had little pita places and pizza places. Now we have like one or two high-end restaurants, but they place big orders. And here's the thing. Whatever metric you put in front of people, whatever number you measure, whatever thing you put up on a dashboard, or whatever you give in terms of, or whatever you give your compensation based upon, is going to drive what they do. And we were frustrated because we wanted like medium-sized restaurants. Initially, when we compensated our salespeople and we reported how many restaurants they brought in, they just brought in loads and loads and loads of little restaurants. And then we changed that to be the dollar value. They brought in virtually no restaurants, but they just spent a vast amount when they did. And so this is a really important thing to understand. Whatever number you present, whatever metric you record, is what people will do. And so whatever metric you have will drive their tactics. And this can become a powerful thing, because if you want your salespeople to bring in lots and lots of small customers, just measure the number of customers. If you want your salespeople to do a particular thing, then measure that and compensate them on that. So whatever your metrics are, that will drive the tactics of your business. And so this becomes super interesting, because that means if you want a particular thing to happen, or if you know that your company grows because of a particular effect or a particular driver, then whatever your strategy is needs to guide what you measure and needs to guide your metrics. And those metrics will drive whatever your employees do in terms of tactics. So as I said, we're going to start at the top and talk about strategy, and then let that guide us into what we need to measure, and that will be the way in which we drive what individuals do. So we're going to talk first about something that I'm just going to grab this, something that Peter Thiel talks a lot about in 0 to 1. And I highly encourage you to read this book if you haven't already. It's very dry, but it is superb. And what Peter Thiel talks about is that there are really two different types of companies. There are companies that grow linearly, and there are companies that grow exponentially. And I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment and draw this. Let's go stop share there. So if we draw over time, and I hope you can see my wonderful little whiteboard, and we draw any measure of size or revenue or market cap or dollar value of a company, you can generalize two different types of companies. There are those that grow linearly, and there are those that grow exponentially. And the thing is that, so linear growth is things like every single month they add $10,000 worth of MRR or 100 new customers. And that's great. And don't get me wrong, there are some very, very good businesses that grow like that. But there are then companies that do things like grow 5% month on month, for example, or they add 10% more customers. And the thing with exponential growth, and unfortunately this is what we're experiencing now with COVID-19, is that it starts off slowly. It often looks like it's underperforming, but once it starts to gather momentum, it becomes insane, and it becomes insanely large. Right, this is how compounding growth works in terms of pension plans. This is why you should be investing in your pension early, because 3% annual dividends accumulates like mad. Unfortunately, this is also why COVID-19 is so terrifying, because it grows exponentially. So, for example, a bacteria, one cell will split into 2, into 4, into 8, into 16, 32, 64. Before you know it, it's an enormous amount. And unfortunately, as we're experiencing, before we know it, a small amount of COVID-19 sufferers or patients has exploded into what, almost 5 million. And I'm afraid it's going to go far larger. So there are these two different types of companies. I'm going to switch back now to the presentation because I want to show you really clear examples of this. So these are just measures of market cap, but for a variety of different industries, there are linear growth and exponential growth companies. So my favorite, we'll start on the bottom right here, is book sales. Barnes & Noble, physical stores selling books, nice growth. Amazon, in terms of marketplace, book growth, exponential. If we look at online news and advertising, Google's growth, exponential. If we look at media consumption, Disney's growth linear, Apple exponential. The particularly interesting thing, we look at the cell phone market, Nokia's growth, good, linear, sold more handsets, handsets went up in price, great. Apple, exponential. Why? Not because the iPhone is a beautiful piece of engineering and it's great and people love it, because the iPhone has the App Store, and the App Store has network effects. And we'll go into those. But there are fundamentally two types of company, linear growth companies and exponential growth companies. And as a startup, you need to be an exponential growth company. And the thing is that we can define or we can pinpoint characteristics that make you exponential growth companies. And these are things that Peter Thiel calls unfair advantages. And we're going to go into that now. So I'm going to stop sharing again, because this is much better when I draw things. So Peter Thiel talks about 5 unfair advantages. And just in general, these are things that get better as they get bigger. I don't have a good collective noun for this. I do apologize, but gets better as it gets better, gets better as it gets bigger. Now, I'm going to highlight 3 of these. Peter Thiel talks about 5. And the reason I'm not going to talk about the other 2 is they're somewhat related to patents, copyright stuff, one-off things that maybe aren't so generally applicable to startups. And the 5th one is somewhat related to cronyism or having one-off deals with politicians, etc. But I'll let you read 0 to 1 for the entirety of this. But we can identify 3 things, and they are economies of scale, economies of scale are very simple, and I'll go into better examples of all of these. But economies of scale are things like if you buy 10 widgets, they'll cost $10 each. But if you order 1,000 widgets, they'll probably cost $5 each. And if you order 10,000 widgets, they'll probably cost $3 each. It's simple bulk purchase discounts. And it comes about from things like if you're building widgets, then you have to set up the production line, you have to churn out some widgets, then you have to change the production the next thing. It's purely the fact that it's easier to produce a large amount of things. So economies of scale. As you buy more, the price gets cheaper. Network effects. My wife and I use Uber here in Toronto. And for the past, I don't know, 3 or 4 months, we've been trying like mad to move to their competitor Lyft. And the problem is that every single time we order a taxi or a car on Lyft, it tells us it takes 5 minutes for it to arrive. But when we look on Uber, it takes 2 minutes. And so we scratch our heads and we go, oh, you know, we really want to use Lyft. We've got to get to dinner or we've got to get to wherever we need to go to. So we're going to use Uber. That is a network effect. Uber has more drivers here in Toronto. Because it has more drivers, it means that there's someone more immediately around the corner to come and pick us up. Because there's someone more immediately around the corner to pick us up, it's a better experience for us. So we don't use Lyft, we go to Uber. But the fact that it's a better experience for us means that there's more people using Uber, which then means that they can support more drivers. This is a network effect. The more people on a platform, the better it gets. The more people that use Uber, the better the Uber experience becomes, and therefore people don't use the competitors like Lyft because the experience is nowhere near as good. And then finally, and this is the wild card, and this is the difficult one, virality effects. As you have more people using your product, they cause more people to come in and become new customers. And I will give you definitions of these, but I want to use some very, very particular examples that you understand. And the example I love to use is Dropbox. Now, my apologies, this example is now becoming a little bit out of date because technology moves on. But imagine 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you're first starting to use Dropbox. What's the great thing about Dropbox? Well, Blake and I are showing you this presentation, and if Blake wants to share it with you guys, if you're using Dropbox, it has value. So if I use Dropbox and Blake uses Dropbox, it becomes useful because I can share this presentation to Blake. But if you all have Dropbox accounts, it becomes more valuable to Blake because now it's not just the value of the presentation I can share with him, it's also the fact that Blake can forward this presentation to all of you. If now the entirety of the DMZ is using Dropbox, then it becomes a central place to store files. It becomes much, much more valuable as you have more people using it. So Dropbox has a network effect. Now, the great thing is that if Blake shares his presentation with you via Dropbox, if you don't have Dropbox accounts, Dropbox will encourage you to create an account, and it will encourage you to upgrade that account. So it has a virality effect. Blake sending you a link to a Dropbox, to a file on Dropbox, causes you, or is likely to cause you to become a Dropbox customer. So it has virality. And here's a super exciting thing. Blake and I both have great taste in 1990s pop music. We both love Britney Spears' Hit Me Baby One More Time. And so I listen to it all the time. Blake listens to it all the time. And the amazing thing is that Dropbox doesn't store two versions of that piece of music. It doesn't store one for Blake and it doesn't store one for me. It actually stores one version and it points Blake to that one version. It points me to that one version. So it has an economy of scale. Because if you have a copy of Britney Spears' Hit Me Baby One More Time, it won't store an additional copy. It'll just point to the same one. So the incremental storage for each new user that comes onto Dropbox actually reduces. They have an economy of scale. I'll give you some more examples, but the core takeaway that I want you to go away with here is you need to have at least one of these. You don't have to have three. Dropbox is a great example because it has three. Amazon floats around with two. Walmart is huge and it really only has one. But if you don't have one of these, you don't have a major driver towards exponential growth. You don't have something that gets better and better and better over time. And that is what causes a juggernaut or a behemoth of a startup. So let's dive back in. I'll give you a very, very clear definition of all of these and some examples. So economies of scale, network effects, virality. Things get cheaper as you buy more of them. The network becomes more valuable as you add more participants, and more users lead to even more users. And here's some examples. So Walmart, just massive purchasing power. Like it just buys, it gets the cheapest price, so it sells at the cheapest price, so it buys more. Facebook has great virality and network effects. Jiffy is a local marketplace here for work to be done on your home. So as they add more workers, it becomes better because there's more availability, they compete on price, etc. As they add more homes, it provides more jobs for those workers. Virality, as I said, is a very, very difficult one to find. If you think you have a virality effect, you probably don't. It's extremely difficult to find really strong, pure virality effects. And the only company I could find that just has virality was Yo, as in the app that you send Yo to somebody else, and then they send it to someone else. It's great. It's an amazing effect if you have it, but don't overweight it. Just because someone recommends your product doesn't mean you have virality. So let's take a step back. We're going to talk about Amazon Marketplace now. So this is not pure Amazon. This is their marketplace offering, where third-party stores sell on the Amazon platform. I'm going to use this as an example of how we dig into these and understand them. And in the early days of Amazon, Jeff Bezos recognized that he had both network effects and economies of scale. And so the question is, if you recognize that you have these things or you want to cultivate these things, how do you make sure you focus on them? And the way that you can do that is by drawing out your virtuous cycles. And so Amazon did this. So let's talk about the marketplace. The marketplace has a number of vendors on it selling various things. If you have one vendor selling kitchen knives, that's great. But if you add in another vendor that sells kitchen knives and cutlery, and you add another vendor that sells kitchen knives and pots and pans, then that means that you're adding more products to this. As you add more products to your to Amazon Marketplace, it means you're getting greater variety of items. It means that Amazon increasingly becomes the one-stop shop for everything. It becomes the everything store. So greater variety means that more people tend to go straight to Amazon to find the things that they want, which leads to more purchases. More purchases then means that there's more transactions in the marketplace, which means you can support more vendors. More vendors in turn lead to another vendor coming on with, for example, cutting boards, or another vendor coming on with crockery. which leads to more products. You get a cycle that improves and improves and improves over time. Now, within each of those vendors, if one vendor is selling kitchen knives and another one comes on selling those kitchen knives, then they'll compete on price. If another vendor comes along, then that vendor may be more competitive and will push the price down. This price competition means that prices are pushed down. So you get lower prices, which means that Amazon becomes the lowest price place to purchase anything you want. So lower prices, again, lead to more purchases. More purchases mean that you can have more vendors. These become cycles that just get better and better over time. What Amazon did in the early days, and what we did at Chef Hero, was to very, very clearly define these cycles and work out what exactly made us have exponential growth. And the core driver that we found was actually very similar to this. It was two things. It was the number of vendors that we had on the marketplace, because that led to price competition and to more products. And specifically, it was the breadth of products or overlap of those products. And then it was how we told them about their price such that they competed on their prices. And when we understood this at Chef Hero, we then defined very, very clear metrics around one, the relative price and price competition, and two, around the number of products and vendors that we had. And then we created teams whose jobs were specifically to onboard more vendors that brought both new products and competition on core products. And we had a second team that specialized in how we gave feedback to those vendors around their prices and price competition and encouraged them to compete and go lower in price. And so I told you we'd start with strategy. We'd look at the drivers of building a large company. And those are really those unfair advantages. And now we're starting to talk about how those unfair advantages work specifically. And this is getting us into those metrics and tactics around what do you need to build as teams and how do you need to measure those. And the thing is that I can tell you to install Salesforce, but that's great. That might or probably will just lead to linear growth. What we really need to work on is what is the spreadsheet or database that leads to price competition that causes your virtuous cycle, which causes this flywheel effect, which causes exponential growth. And that's where we're coming from. We need to understand your overall strategy to guide what are those things that make you really, really big, to guide what teams and processes and products do you build, and how do you measure them in terms of metrics, and how do you ensure that tactically that is being executed upon. So does that make sense from the high level? Now I want to give you a bit more deeper stuff, because this is all very hypothetical. Let's actually dive into how do we understand your business. And we're going to start talking about metrics and tactics. And we're going to use the analogy of the startup as a production line. So again, I'm going to stop sharing this. Sorry, Blake, I'm seeing a few questions on chat. I can't see them. Do we have particular questions, or do we want to ask them at the end, or what's?
We do have maybe a clarification around network effects versus virality. When you talk about network effects, you're looking more at partners, and then virality more at customers, just to distinguish between the two. But any thoughts on that, Philip?
It's a good question. I apologize. I've jumped over these quite quickly because I'm trying to squeeze a lot in. I really recommend you read 0 to 1. The basic effect of a network effect is it's more valuable for people within the network, within the company itself. The virality effect is someone within causes an external party to come in. So virality effect is I'm on the platform, or I'm doing this thing, Blake isn't, but for some reason, because of a mechanism you have, I encourage Blake to come in. That's the virality. And now that Blake and I are both in this, the product that I had before is more valuable because Blake is here. Because maybe Blake and I interact, or maybe Blake sells something to me for cheaper, or maybe I'm doing a service and Blake's offering the same service and we're competing, or we're working with each other. So that's the network effect. Network effect is more the internal, the virality is more about bringing in.
Perfect.
Okay. So we need to understand how we can look at your company holistically in order to work out what it's doing. And what my operations mentors encouraged me to actually read was a book called The Goal. I highly recommend this if you haven't read it. It's by, forgive me, Eliyahu Rosenstein, I apologize. And it is a quasi-fictional book about a production factory in North America. And it really beautifully works through very, very simple operations management theories. And the great thing is that startups are all massively different. They're varied. You're all doing super cool things. You're all doing wonderful stuff. But really fundamentally, you kind of look the same as each other. And so just suspend disbelief for a moment. Let me talk you through this. Most startups have some form of top of funnel marketing or outreach or something that happens that leads into some form of sales, whether that's an actual salesperson doing demos or closing deals, or whether that's some form of sign-up form on your website that converts into a paying customer. There's some sort of step of top of funnel to bottom of funnel, and that leads to some form of active customer. And that active customer might be using your product, they might be purchasing things, they might be going to your website and viewing ads and therefore getting ad revenue, but you've got some form of active customer. And they require a whole host of different things like accounting, they require some customer support, they might require some invoicing, they might require a whole host of other stuff. So we can sort of draw these on here. Now, maybe you say to me, well, Philip, that's overly simplistic. Totally agree. Maybe you have an inbound and outbound, or maybe you have a sales process that has multiple steps. So, yeah, bear with me. We can add another block here, or maybe you've got some implementation phase here. Trust me, you can probably, in 99% of cases, draw your company as a series of blocks like this. So let's just pull this back to a simplistic example. Let's imagine you are selling online accounting software at $100 per month. And so you have some ads running on Google. You encourage people to come to your website. They sign up on your website and they become active customers. That's great. You've got a block of marketing that leads into sales, that leads into active. Now, the problem with this is that, or the great thing about this, I should say, is that over the past few years, people have specialized in each of these individual components. So let's take, for example, sales. There are people who are sales specialists, consultants, etc., that use particular tools like, for example, Salesforce, HubSpot. They speak in particular ways. They have things like sales funnels, they have conversion rates, etc. There's a whole host of work that has been done very specifically on sales. Again, similar things with marketing. Products like Marketo, marketing funnels, marketing specialists, accounting software, etc., customer support. Each of these is an area of specialization, of depth, that people have become real specialists in, consultants in, have dedicated their lives to, and have metrics, ways of talking, ways of measuring that are very specific to that. And that's great. But the problem is that your company needs to operate holistically. And if you over-optimize one of these blocks, you may be under-optimizing holistically. What do I mean? Imagine you've got a young, inexperienced founder, and the founder says, you know what, everyone, we've got to raise money in 6 months' time. So in order to raise money in 6 months' time, we've got to grow like mad over the next 3 months. So salespeople, I want you to go out, I want you to close as many deals as possible, go out there, get their selling, bring in new customers. And over the next 1, 2, 3 months, it's brilliant. You know, salespeople are closing deals, everything's great, but weird things start to happen. And after a few months, you start to see customers complaining, and then you start to see customers churning. And after 3 or 4 months, the founder is super frustrated because they're saying, look, sales, you're doing an amazing job, but what's happening here? Like customer support, there's all these problems. Like product, why are people not using this? We're churning all these customers and we've stopped growing. Well, the problem is that you can over-optimize one part of your company like sales at the risk of under-optimizing another. So imagine those salespeople have gone out and under the pressure from the CEO and being pushed to close targets, they've missold the product, or they've promised something that's not there, or they don't have all the deals that they want, so they've gone to different types of customer, or they've maybe closed deals and they've given a large discount. And the problem is that you've then got customers who maybe are not your ideal customer, or they've been missold, or they've got a strange price, and then they start to churn. And the problem is that it's far too easy to over-optimize one part of a company at the cost of under-optimizing another, or to pass problems between different parts of the companies. And because you've got specialists that specialize in just one area, you can do this very easily. You can build a super efficient sales team that sells a product that no one wants to buy, or sorry, that no one wants to use. They can sell a product, but then their users churn. Or you could sell a product, but then you can't collect on it because you've got bad debt. Or you sell a product, but then people don't actually like using that product because the product doesn't work properly. Or, and sales, by the way, is a super simple example. I don't mean this to be specific. You could have marketing that targets and gets really great conversions into marketing qualified leads, but those marketing qualified leads never actually convert into sales because they're the wrong type of lead. You can super optimize one part at the cost of another. And so what we can do here is we can start to look at each of these blocks as, or we can analyze each of these individual blocks as some form of function that takes inputs and converts them into outputs. And this is where our operations management theory comes in, and this is where I recommend you read the goal. So this might be things like inputs of marketing qualified leads plus salespeople plus, say, HubSpot leads into some form of output in terms of active customers. Okay, and as your company matures, we can start to define what is the function that takes these inputs and turns them into these outputs. And we can do that for each of these blocks. We can say there is some function in marketing, and there's some function in active in accounting and then ARs, etc. And this output is marketing qualified leads. So we can start to chain these into each other. And we could, hypothetically, create an enormous equation that describes the entirety of your company as a series of functions. And that would be great, because if you can do that, then you can mathematically optimize your company. Except it will be really fucking difficult to do. So, how can we take these individual blocks and understand your company holistically in a way that doesn't distort because you over-optimize marketing, for example, at the cost of sales? And the great thing is, and unfortunately I don't have time to talk about these in real detail, but the great thing is we have two measures that tell you if your company is holistically optimal. And those are customer acquisition cost and customer lifetime value. Because everything up to this point falls into customer acquisition cost. And everything from this point, sorry, this is the problem with not having a large whiteboard to do this on. Normally I'm in a big presentation conference room and there's lots of space. Everything here falls into customer lifetime value. And so if we analyze your company through this lens of customer acquisition cost to customer lifetime value, and I apologize for time, I can't go into how we do that effectively, but I can provide you with plenty of resources. If your company is misbalanced, then it will show up in this. Ideally, you want a ratio of customer acquisition cost, of LTV is greater than 3 times your customer acquisition cost, ideally. What I mean by that is for every dollar you put into customer acquisition cost, you expect over the life of those customers to receive $3 back. Now, there may be very good reasons that you are well below this ratio. There may be reasons like you have a network effect and you need to acquire customers to build that up. You may have virality effects, etc. But if you do not have this ratio, you need to understand why and understand how to get into this ratio. And the great thing is that if you don't have this, then there are two very, very simple levers to play with. You can either decrease your customer acquisition cost, or you can increase your customer lifetime value. And within customer acquisition cost, your levers are either use the same sales method or change to a different sales channel, or optimize that. And within customer lifetime value, your options really are increase your price, reduce churn, or, and this is a very, very weak way of doing it, increase your operational efficiency so your gross margin goes down. Now, as a company, you need to understand these, because if you have the ability, or if your CAC to LTV ratio is below this, and it's because your CAC is too high and you can change to a different sales channel, then you need to move towards that new sales channel. And so what we might need to do in terms of operations is to say, you have been operating with outbound enterprise sales who are very expensive. You need to run a test on, for example, inbound, or an inside sales team that's doing outbound sales, but they're doing it from an office somewhere where they're calling and demoing. That is what I mean about focusing on your operations. Or we might say, well, we can't change your sales process in any way. And your sales funnel is pretty efficient at this point in time, so we can't reduce customer acquisition cost. So now we need to look at customer lifetime value. Maybe you can't sell your product at any higher price. So that means that we then need to improve the life of your customers. So we need to reduce churn. Reducing churn could be, the ways to reduce churn could be to improve your customer support. So if you have problems or tickets or issues, they respond faster. At which point you need to start thinking about a ticketing system, maybe Zendesk, Intercom, etc., to make your customer support team more responsive. Or we might look at your churn and say this is actually indicative of not having product market fit. If that's the case, your product team needs to go and interview customers and understand what is going on. And so we can use this ratio of customer acquisition cost to customer lifetime value to understand what is working and what is not working within your company. And when we understand that, then we can start to identify what are the areas that you need to work on in operations. And once you understand those areas, then we can start to dive into, if you need to, for example, decrease churn, then here are some things that you could do to decrease churn. And that might be crazy stuff. That might be hiring a load of contractors to do something, or an outsourced team, or building a really amazing ticketing system, or having just the best support and the best support website. But those are the things that will inflect these two numbers. Does that make sense? So Blake will share this presentation for you. I'm going to go back to sharing the screen. You're basically going to see exactly that. We can model a company as a production line with these various blocks. Each of these blocks could be modeled as a function of inputs and outputs. And by the way, I really believe you should do this. You should be able to say, if I recruit 2 more salespeople, then I would expect to get an incremental $10,000 in MRR each month. You need to do that. But the better way of looking at your company holistically is to look at this ratio of customer acquisition cost to lifetime value, and then use that to identify where you have bottlenecks or issues or things you need to work on. And then we need to dive into those. So in summary, we are concerned with holistically optimizing your company in ways that it more effectively and efficiently converts those inputs into outputs. So what we started with is understanding how we can build a fast growth startup. And that involved talking about things like unfair advantages, network effects, economies of scale, virality that just get better over time. And then from that, we used the virtuous cycles analysis to look at how we could really dig into that and understand what were the mechanisms that drove them. And that starts to tell you what are the things that you really need to be focusing on and working on. And that starts to drive your metrics and how you build teams, how you build tactics, or how you build products to double down on those things. And then we took a very bottoms-up approach to this, and we used the analogy of a production line. We said that we can break your company down into little blocks. And I highly encourage you to analyze each of those blocks, because you need to be able to understand what's happening in each. But if you want to optimize your company holistically, which is the goal here, then we need some way to measure your company holistically. And that's where the ratio of customer acquisition cost to customer lifetime value is fundamentally important. And that then, combined with those virtuous cycles, will guide us into what you need to do to optimize your operations. Because this is not about cookie cutter, install this tool, measure this number, do this thing. This is about, there is a thing like virtuous cycles in Amazon Marketplace, or there is a sharing effect with Dropbox, or there is a bulk purchase effect like with Walmart that will turn your company into an enormous behemoth. And that is the thing that you need to work on in operations. That will make you huge. Thank you very much. I hope that makes sense. I can spend a few more minutes on questions. I'm also very aware that this is quite a high-level presentation, and I'm sure you're going away with a lot of questions around customer acquisition cost and customer lifetime value. And I need to talk to Blake about that one. I can provide a lot of resources on that one, and I think we may also need either a video presentation from previously on that one, or I'll do another presentation around that so we can dig into those. But please use customer acquisition cost and lifetime value as measures of holistic balance of your company. Thank you.
Awesome. First of all, thank you, Philip. That was great. Taking a lot of notes and stuff too. So great to get a sense of, again, high level strategy, things to think about in terms of scaling. Does anybody right now have? We do have about 5 minutes for questions. Any questions right now? And put it in the chat, or feel free to go off mute, and we can go from there. Maybe, Philip, maybe I'll kick us off, and I'm curious. It relates more to the example you had from Chef Hero, and maybe once after, kind of, we're getting into the tactical ends of it. I don't want to get too far down before we talk about the strategy. But when you're talking about having maybe a missed metric or the wrong metric, and it's driving wrong behavior, as we go through this, I'm sure we're gonna, we test out different metrics. Do you have a guideline around, is there a timeline to test out a metric until you say, no, it's not working, or we just shift this? Or how do you view like the metric experimentation in a startup? And yeah.
So taking a step back, I take Paul Graham's advice and thoughts that startups are very illogical. And so it's often very, very difficult to try and think your way out of problems. Often it's better to not even try and think out. It's better to experiment. And so I'm not saying just do random things, but what I'm saying is, if you have a problem or you have an issue, or you have a challenge, it's almost always better to just try and run a little experiment to understand what's happening, to understand what the drivers are, and to go from there. So that's my general approach to things. But I've never thought about experimentation around metrics. And my reason has always been that I think you can think these things through. And I think that whatever metric you have needs to be so representative of your strategy that you should be able to pinpoint it. And if you can't think what is the main driver of growth within your company, then you need to do something to really think through that, or to understand that. And so where I'm going to with this is, I don't think experimentation around metrics is necessarily the thing, but I do think that you need to experiment around different messages, different products perhaps, or different ways of operating until you really understand what is the lever that inflects your growth. And that should lead to your metric. What I mean by that was using an example of those early sales at Chef Hero. The lever that inflected growth actually was dollar value transactions from a number of restaurants within the marketplace. And so it wasn't number of restaurants, because there were a lot of small restaurants not purchasing much doesn't do that. But we clearly didn't understand the lever when we were trying to set that as a metric. So if you're getting that, you need to understand what the driver is, and maybe that involves experimentation, and then get clear on that metric.
Right on. All right. Thank you. That's great. Maybe time for one more question, if that's okay. But yeah, if anybody has any thoughts, and I know Thomas has said he's made a ton of notes, so he said thanks. Maybe we'll, if there's nothing else, I know Philip had a great suggestion. If we can circle back, and if there's more resources on CAC LTV, or the need to maybe go into to a second session. We have 5 weeks now, so we can kind of plan that out as a cohort. But yeah, Philip, maybe we'll leave it there. But thank you so much for the time. I know 8 a.m. in Toronto, it's early, but appreciate starting off.
It's not early when you have a 19-month-old. Don't worry about that one. Thank you very much. Please stay safe, everyone. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to speak to you soon.